Aha! This is Labors, and these are the paints I used for some sweet tree bark action. I primed the Mini with Vallejo's Mecha Primer Black using the airbrush. I start applying some mournfang brown with a soft dry brush. I'm using these Army Painter Masterclass dry brushes, but any makeup brush with a similar size could work. The brush is a little bit damp, but I removed most of the moisture on a paper towel and I dipped the brush in the paint pot. As I'm slapping the paint on the model, more and more moisture is coming from the bristles, so the paint won't dry as fast and I have plenty of time to work with. I'm just dampening my brush through my wet palettes parchment paper, so the consistency is more diluted over time, so I'm aiming to cover all the crevices of the tree bark textures. On some areas, like the groin or the left leg, you can keep some black recessed shadows, since those areas are quite hard to reach and the character has hunched over pose, so you don't really need to highlight those parts. Basically, I'm highlighting everything that is not an extreme shadow, and if I can cover some parts of these areas with a thinner consistency to create a smoother gradient. This mournfang brown is kind of a warm brown color, so I have a warmer color scheme in mind for the character and a colder one for the base. If you have any fear of applying paint straight from the pot, just make sure your brush is wet so the moisture on your brush will dilute the paint anyway. So don't approach this like your tiny hands are shaking, because I will slap on them. And if you don't have citadel pots, if you have dropper bottles, just use a wet palette and apply the paint from there. I start highlighting the wood with gold brown. This is a quite warm ochre brown color with just the right amount of value step between the mournfang brown. I think you guys are going to love this highlight process because it's very easy. First, I build up the highlights on the shapes, like light is coming from the left and from the top, so the areas that will receive larger volumes of light are the left side of the Mini. I'm using a thin layer consistency, and the way I build up these highlights, I'm creating lines that follow the shapes of the grooves of the wood. The texture over the bark has these very fine recess areas, but I cover those for now, and I only leave the larger gaps darker between the larger sections. The way you can create a nice transition from the highlighted areas to the darker ones is to leave the recesses darker and paint the bark between those areas, so you will highlight with the same value over the recesses and these transition areas with darker recess shadows. The fun part about painting a Mini that has this very heavily textured skin is that you don't need a lot of blending if you use thin layers. The textured plastic always has this benefit, and the key to have a nice consistency is to wipe off the excess paint on your paper towel so you can prevent the paint from flooding the crevices, so you can protect your tiny hands from me, because if that happens, I will slap on them. On the larger bark pieces, you can imitate the bark pattern with some tiny lines following the general shapes of the pieces. I'm applying these thin layers on the top of each other, reducing the size of them layer by layer to create some fast blends. If you like to, you can glaze over the larger pieces to have smooth surfaces like Granny's butt cheek, but I'm not going to do that now because I'm completely fine with these blends that layering provides, and this also reduces the painting time. If you flat some of the recesses, don't worry about it, we will fix that in the later steps. Right now, just focus on adding volume to the highlights over the character. Next, I mix some ice yellow to the gold brown to push the contrast over the main highlight areas. I'm using thin layers again, and at this step I really try to avoid hitting any recess areas. Generally, I go over the areas that are facing up, starting with the left shoulder and the chest area going down on the forearm. I'm still adding more detail with each brush stroke, creating some fine lines along the surface. I keep in mind that light is coming a little bit from the left, so I'm building up these highlights over the left side of each area. I also have to look out for our focal point. The focal point needs to be over the head, so I'm adding more volume over the shoulders, the top part of the knee and forearm. I'm picking out the joints on the large fingers, one by one, adding a little bit more volume to the knuckles and the larger fingertips, and connecting them with more narrow highlights, and I place these highlights according to my light source as well. After that, I go back and I add some detail to the surface with mournfang brown, creating some recess areas. If I previously hit the recess over a maximum highlight area, now I can fix it using a thin layer consistency with mournfang brown. You need a brush with a nice tip to do that, and if you need to, you can go back with the recent highlight color if you make a mistake with this value. The finer your lines, the better the results you will have, so make sure you use a consistency that flows nicely from your bristles, but it's not too runny, like the contents of Granny's colostomy bag. So that's about it, guys. I hope you found this video useful, and hopefully you can apply what I did to any wood related stuff you need to paint. As always, a huge thanks to my patrons for their support. If you guys are interested in more Marvel Zombies or Massive Darkness 2 PDF guides and full-length video guides, please consider joining my Patreon page. And a special shoutout goes to Corbradit Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy Macrash, Panaman45 and Michael Kerr. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.